Good morning and welcome back to another episode of Faith Infused Leadership. I am really excited today to have as our guest Michael Welp, and he is the co-founder of White Men as Full Diversity Partners, which we'll find out a little bit more about on this episode. And he's also the author of 4 Days to Change, 12 Radical Habits to Overcome Bias and Thrive in a Diverse World. And Michael and I, it's interesting. I've lived in Sandpoint for about 7.5 years, and I don't think we've even crossed paths. We know some of the same people, run in circles of people that are connected by this 2 degrees of separation. And we had never really met until a couple of weeks or a week ago for coffee. We met at a local coffee shop, and I'm really fascinated by you as a person and the work that you do in the world. And so why don't you take a moment, Michael, and introduce yourself, and then we'll talk about this important work that you do.
Well, thanks for having me, Debbie. I'm excited to get to know you and connect and to share some conversation and see where it goes.
Yeah.
Well, so we both land here in Sandpoint, Idaho. I actually grew up in Iowa, so I started in the land of corn, and now I'm in the land of potatoes. Most people on the East Coast don't know the difference between Iowa and Idaho. So
That's a true statement.
Another little lesson here. Idaho is further west. So, I mean, in my life, my dad was an engineer. I grew up in Iowa. I went to Iowa State, and I thought I was going to be an electrical engineer. And eventually I realized, no, that there are other things that call me more. And I ended up, learning about the fields of organizational development or facilitating groups. That was all fascinating. I switched my senior year to psychology, never looked back, but thought that was too research oriented where I was studying. So I went to Outward Bound and I facilitated wilderness. Outward Bound teaches people you can do more than you think you can and builds compassion. And we do that around the world. And I worked in the boundary waters of Minnesota, canoe expeditions, and some winters dog sledding. And then I went to the East Coast to learn about facilitating better in an organizational change master's program. And I really got surprised by all the diversity learning. And that was my entry level into deep looking at race, racism and sexism and homophobia. And I got the chance after that to go to South Africa and facilitate interracial team building with Outward Bound, which was just after Nelson Mandela's release from prison. And I went to, it was a healing thing for me to do over there, be part of these groups coming together, mining groups and banks across race for the first time in South Africa, and have these colleagues that I was co-facilitating with from Africa. And that woke me up to seeing how I was like a white male in South Africa, not that different. They were like these good guys one-on-one and yet part of an oppressive system. And it just compelled me, Debbie, to come back to the US and work with other guys like me, other white men around diversity. So I went the research route to do a dissertation about how white men learn about diversity, and found that we learn everything from women, people of color, and that's like not sustainable to put you all in the burden of educating us about gender or about other issues. And so we started an experiment, another ex-Outward Bound guy and I, to do 4-day sessions for white guys around what's it mean to be white, what's it mean to be male, and what's our interest in that too. Instead of quote unquote helping others with their issues, how do we liberate ourselves and transform ourself, which is an act of faith too. And that was 25 years ago. So we've been just doing that in this company you call White Men as Full Diversity Partners, which is a mouthful and a confusing thing for people to hear as a name of a diversity consulting firm. And so that's the background I'd say to start with.
Yeah. So as you talk, it makes me think, I want to ask you the question, what's been the most surprising, I don't know if I want to say reaction, but let's go to like South Africa and then the work you do today. So kind of 2 examples. What's been the most surprising theme or thing that you've learned? Because you talk about too, having to be self-aware, which is a big piece as a leader that needs to happen. What's been the biggest surprise to you that you've learned about yourself? You talked about in Africa that you had more in common with the white men than what you thought. What's
Yeah.
surprising?
Well, I remember learning about race and gender issues and understanding how, okay, I understand how I grew up in a system that is inherently has racism woven into it. I can remember examples. I remember my mom when my sister brought home a black boyfriend or just a friend from 8th grade to play at home. And she's like, don't bring him home again. She was from the South. She was from Pensacola, Florida. So those kinds of things stuck in me as like, yeah, I'm part of that weaving in of different fabric, but also a lot of passive sort of oppression in the system for people. And there wasn't a lot of diversity in my town in Iowa growing up.
Yeah.
So the surprising thing about this was back then was, wait a minute, I'm a good guy, and yet I'm part of this that's just as much part of the problem as I am part of the solution. How do I bring this to other people like me in a way that's not about shame or blame or anything, but about how do we create the kind of world we want to create? And I think the other thing, surprisingly for me in my journey, Debbie, is that it's been a very liberating thing for me. Who would have thought that me as a white male I would have found my voice through diversity? Because a lot of people think diversity is where people of color find their voice or women find your voice or whatever. But here I am as a straight white guy finding that my path, and it's a living example that everybody benefits from work around diversity partnerships. It's not just about helping other people with their issues. I get to become a better partner with significant others through the freedom I found to jump out of my cultural box that I didn't even know I was in. It's been really helpful for my relationships with my daughters. And it just makes me even more free to be human, fully human.
Yeah. So there's the $1 million question. What does it mean to be fully human?
Yeah.
In your mind. Yeah.
If I answer that, I get $1 million. That's awesome.
I know. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We could have $1 million if we answered that one.
Well, if somebody just frees themselves in their life, let's have them send that to you, and then you can buy a new sailboat.
And actually learn how to sail instead of just relying on friends.
So now what was the question again? I forgot the question.
What does it mean to be fully human to you?
Okay.
Like if you had to describe that for yourself as something, that you feel.
Well, one of the things for me is like, okay, I grew up in a culture that is, what does it mean to be a white male? Most of us, we never have to leave that cultural box. So we don't even know we're in a culture. It's like a fish in water. It teaches me that I should go it alone. I shouldn't ask for help because that's a weakness. I should, the Marlboro Man, John Wayne ethos. I should see the world in black and white, take all the uncertainty out of it. I should derive my value as a person from action, fixing things, as opposed to beingness. It's about my doingness. I remember a line in a movie, my dad was a real man. He worked till the day he died, as if we'd stop working, we don't have value. And disconnect from my heart, Debbie. It's like, we think, I'm sort of jumping forward here to name some of these traits of what I see as threads of white male culture in the US, but the assumption that I'm either rational or I'm emotional at the same time. And most credibility in organizations comes from your rational data, given the data, right? So that leads us to think we better leave our emotions behind, better disconnect from them, because they sort of poison the rational part of us. Other cultures don't do that. And that's like, so for when you say, what does it mean to be fully human? To me, it's like, okay, I'm seeing this water I've been raised in. And not only do I judge myself by it, but I have an invisible way where I look at other people that I hire and say, who's qualified, who's promotable. And it emphasizes certain human traits and de-emphasizes other human traits, teaches us that they're sort of not connected to, productivity or efficiency or whatever. So emphasizes more masculine traits, emphasizes the head, emphasizes the doingness. and I end up leaving part of my humanity behind.
Mm.
It's part of the humanity that makes effective partnerships with others, including significant others. So for the men listening and white folks, like, what part of my humanness do I de-emphasize, and what's the cost for me having shallower relationships with others, with myself? Am I really tuned into my body and my feelings and my beingness? Do I nurture that? Can I pause? You and I talked before about just having space for silence and beingness. It's like all of a sudden all those pieces have room. So I don't want to throw away the culture and say it's bad. I want to use its strength, and I want to have the freedom to step outside of that culture. That's one of the messages of my TED talk, trying to show what's to be gained from the looking in that window and that mirror around my culture, and not demonize it, but I get the freedom to reclaim parts of my humanity that sometimes I've taught they're sort of in the way. And that's, to me, it'd be fully human, is what part of myself do I leave at the door in my family life, in my work life, and what parts of it can I reclaim, and it gives me a fullness.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for talking about that, because
Is that worth $1 million? Is that
no, it's worth $1 million. You betcha. Well, and I appreciate that, because coming from corporate America myself and being an executive in 2 companies, there is such a high demand really for the masculinity, and the action orientation. And I have been seeing a little bit of a shift. I used to go to this conference every year until last year with COVID, where you would see kind of upcoming emerging things happening down in San Jose. And it was interesting to me. The CEO of Cliff Bars was the last person that I saw, and he talked about how he has a meditation room in his executive office, and when that door is closed, people are not allowed to interrupt him. And so I see things starting to move in a direction of dropping into your heart space and your beingfulness. And but the impatience in me wants it to go faster. But are you seeing a shift starting to happen, even outside the work you're doing, but like in our culture in the US anyway? I know you do things all across the world, but
yes and no. I look for evidence of change and I see it. I look for evidence of no change and I see that. So or organizations have I think that as the younger generations become more leaders in organizations, some of them are more open to and they're not willing to reinforce the lifestyle that they saw their parents go through. It's like one son told his dad, who was a lead engineer, he's like, I'm never going to work for that company. I saw what they did to you. You were never around, Dad, when I grew up. It's like, so there's a demand more to have more balance, and then there's a realization that it actually brings more back to the company. Just like COVID, all of a sudden people are trusted now to work remotely more. They find that they're even more productive, and so we're gonna see what happens whenever the companies want to control everybody and put them back in the office, and they're like, no, I like this freedom and I'll give you more. And so once you unleash more of that freedom, and it actually shows and demonstrates that it creates more innovation, it creates more commitment, hopefully it will continue in that trajectory that you're talking about.
Yeah, I hope it does too. I was reading an article in the Harvard Business Review, I don't know, last quarter, that they were talking about how there are a lot of companies now that are budgeting for people to stay home and looking at selling their office spaces, and which is to me a really nice sign of change that's occurring. But what I always find interesting is, and I'd like your take on this, is why it takes almost like a proof, like we have to prove that something will work before people step into it with trust.
One answer to that, I think, is that there is a part of the mainstream culture and in businesses, there's because we have grown up and being, and thinking we have value because we fix things, white men and white men, we have a critical focus. So we look at things through what's wrong here and what do we need to do to improve. And that's a reactive stance towards what do I want to avoid allowing something to happen that I don't want to have happen. It's a control strategy versus a trust in the what could possibly be unleashed here. And so in my leadership, am I motivated more by what I don't want to have happen? And that impacts how I lead, or am I motivated by what I want to unleash and trust that, and how do we do the best of both? That's sort of like that theory X, theory Y sort of balance. We need to have control systems and organizations to manage, the assumptions of, do workers need to be controlled or do they need to really be freed up? There needs to be the best of both. Otherwise, if you just build systems on control, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. People are going to feel like they're robots and they're going to want to just go somewhere else. And to have that freedom that you're talking about, the human spirit can have that space.
Yeah. And so kind of talking about that, I know one of my business mentors and friends, Dr. Horsman, talks about, and this is becoming more well-known, but how we're moving into this new Renaissance period. How do you see that impacting the work that you're doing as we move into kind of a new Renaissance?
I don't know. When you say Renaissance, it's sort of like an awakening and a sort of an open to new things. Because I think there's a lot. One of the things that's happening right now in our country and broader is the polarization of the media and the narratives that people have of each other across a difference, whether it's political difference, are getting extremely narrow and unsophisticated and critical of each other. And so the narratives themselves, we dehumanize each other around, what's the other side, quote unquote, and do they have character, good character, or what? It's like, so it's an interesting time while there's a renaissance of new possibilities, we have to figure out how these other factors of polarization are ripping us apart and disconnecting us and unhumanizing us from each other. And I think those are sort of like crossing. And then in the workplace, maybe that's one of the few places where people can actually understand each other as humans across political differences, class differences, race differences, et cetera, where it's not happening in their social media channels. It's not happening sometimes in segregated neighborhoods and other kinds of things. Even a lot of political, I saw a segregation article about where a lot of metropolitan areas and parts of the country are imbalanced from a political population stance. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of factors to that connected renaissancing needs to work through.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you talk about work, it's almost as if they have a common vision and a common goal, and so that creates the commonality. And then outside of work, we're seeing more polarization happen. That's interesting. I have to think about that one a little bit further as we move into that. But Michael, if you were to say to people, like, as we're seeing this becoming narrower and narrower, what would you say to people? Like, what are some things that we can do just on a day-to-day basis as humans to try to widen that?
To widen what?
What you were talking about with the polarization and the differences between whether it be politics or race or whatever it is that's becoming more narrow. Yeah.
Bridge the divide.
Yeah.
I thought you said widen the divide.
Well, I meant like widen the fact that I was looking at it in the inverse of what you were talking about. Yeah.
Well, for me, okay, we all can think about our families and where in our families do we have differences that we don't really work through or talk through, or I've got some parts of my family that they're just like, well, I know that these kind of conversations about political differences can like rip a family apart, so I'm not going to go there. And I'm like, okay, I need to respect that. A part of me wants to reach out and use that as a model with some, but I'm like, okay, I need to go where I can actually, there's organizations like Braver Angels, Essential Partners, that give tools and techniques about how do you have conversations across these divides. And they're all about curiosity. They're all about getting into inquiry with each other, allowing ourselves to get much more appreciative a view of each other's world, so that the questions that they guide you to use are, what's at the heart of your political beliefs? And what life experiences have you had that have allowed you to have those beliefs? So it's a very sophisticated version of understanding somebody coming. Why do they have that perspective? And then hearing what drives that. There's a great documentary on PBS called Divided We Fall. It's at dividedwefalltv.org, and it brings red and blue folks together in different parts of the country, and has dialogues, and eventually they actually separate and come up with the same 3 recommendations for the country, and they're shocked when they hear that from each other. It's like, so how do we get curious about each other and realize there's wisdom in all the different perspectives? And it's not like right versus wrong, it's like right versus right. Everybody's holding on to different values that they think are what's going to protect our country and its core and in the future. So I can tune into that some somebody that says all lives matter, or it's like doesn't seem like they're tending to or awakening to the dynamic that's happening for Black folks in the US and around the world, around the police violence and all kinds of oppression. And they're not necessarily against that. They're just standing for other values or other things that they see are core.
Right.
The sameness difference paradox is a really important one. In our work, we call it sameness difference. So if I stand on the sameness side of the sameness difference, I'm going to say, why are we focusing on differences? Isn't that just divisive? Why that just rips us apart? Why don't we just focus on inclusion and not on diversity? And so they're going to say all lives should matter. And if I stand on the different side of the paradox, I'm going to say, you know what? In our world, it looks to me from what's happening that Black lives don't matter. So I'm going to say Black lives matter. And I'm going to stand for that. And so that's standing on the different side. I need to acknowledge that people are dealing with things that I don't, as a white guy, as a white male. And you as a woman are navigating things in the world around your safety and things that I don't have to as a man. So how do I do both? How do I connect to you and everybody else on a humanness scale? And how do I also like recognize the different world that you live in from me? Recognizing that you don't have the same experience as every woman, but you do have a thread that's different than me. And I want to be curious about that, how that shows up. And if I understand your world more and what water you have to swim in that I don't, and folks, Black colleagues, what world they're swimming in, it's going to help me partner with them better. And nothing of that has anything to do with something I've done wrong or anything. My world isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. So I want to see a broader perspective of the world.
Yeah, thank you for that, because as I think about that, it's almost as if, and I'm making a broad generalization here, but it's almost as if sometimes looking at the difference brings about guilt and shame for people. And they're not really sure how to navigate through those waters. And you remind me, and thank you for sharing that resource, but it reminds me of one of my all-time favorite commercials. I'm sure you've seen it, the Heineken commercial.
Yeah.
Where they build a bar. I love that commercial because it proves that, well, and it doesn't have to be proved, but the point that you were talking about, where really there's not as much difference as what we think, but we tend to walk into things with assumptions and judgment versus looking at it through the lens of curiosity.
Yeah, it's not, the answer isn't to minimize the differences and pretend they're not there.
Right.
Actually, to amplify them and understand where what's behind them and where they came from. and then this commonality will just emerge naturally from that process.
Yeah, creating a bigger awareness.
Right, right. Yeah, I like that commercial too. We've actually shown it in some of our sessions.
Nice.
It's a good global piece. There's actually a lot of commercials now that are by companies that give really powerful messaging. Procter and Gamble is one of our clients. The talk, the look, the pause, those are all videos that they put out that are really powerful around awareness building.
I'll have to look those up. So I do want to ask, Michael, everybody has a different interpretation or definition of faith. And so I'd love to hear what your definition of faith is and how that has impacted your business and what you've done in the world.
Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a lot of levels to that.
Mm-hmm.
I connect more on a spiritual level to that concept than on a religious level. Of, you know, I was raised Catholic. I've been Quaker for a long time. I don't really practice any particular, more of an open spiritual. I see my work as a very spiritual way of, I see my deepest calling is to open the world for love to flow. So where do I feel constrictions in the world around love flowing and connection? And that I just happen to zero in on the piece around race and gender and other kinds of differences. And wakening up any of us around the world to our insiderness, where we actually have more experience being insiders than outsiders. Everybody has both. You know, I might, as a white guy, feel like an insider from a race gender perspective, but I may not be conscious of that. Most of the time I might connect to the outsider dimensions because I'm an introvert, or I maybe belong to the other political party than the dominant people in the organization, or some people, because the dominant mode in an organization is to have kids and I don't. If that was the case, you know, the outsiderness I can see in my life. I see the insiderness, and can I see how I can use that insiderness to include others? Because right now that burden to educate insiders often falls to outsiders, and that's not a sustainable process. So back to faith, your question about faith. I think it goes back to this question of, am I being motivated by fear and what I don't want to have happen, and reimposing and reinforcing control in systems? Or am I actually unleashing and believing in people and their potential, and organizing and looking for what can emerge? Am I using a power with, am I creating a cultures of power with instead of power over, or colluding with power over in a way that, you know, squeezes out the life, the freedom, the possibilities for folks? So for me, how do I not overuse some of those white male culture tendencies of over focus on doing? How do I just create more space for people to breathe, people to feel, there's silence in conversations as people reflect deeper. There's space for head and heart. There is space for people's freedom and energy. And how do we actually unleash people and not over control people? That's an act of faith. It's certainly an act of faith as a leader in an organization, to trust that instead of just focusing on control. And something about faith is also just, how do I live that in my body? Just like you and I were practicing that exercise before. How do we connect in the moment with each other and trust that whatever's going to emerge is what's alive is real? There's the faith to be in an appreciative place with each other. There's the faith to being a being place instead of only a doing mode with each other. And that gives more space for connection and flow.
Yeah, include some trust there, trust in yourself and trust in the people around you too. Yeah.
Right. And trust that if there's an awkwardness, that's okay too. Welcoming whatever shows up. Yeah. So faith in our wholeness as humans, faith in others' wholeness, faith that there's a power for healing and growth as strong as there is for other stuff. I mean, I could probably take a stab in all kinds of different directions around faith. For me, it's like, do I trust myself? Do I trust my own voice? part of my whole life journey is trusting my voice. My company name, other company name has been Equal Voice. And that's like, I got to teach what I need to learn myself, and claiming my voice and having the faith in that, growing up really shy as a boy, and leading in a different way from my heart. There's a faith in myself that I'm bringing something unique that's not necessarily the classic alpha male leader role model. So that's an ongoing journey.
Yeah, and I would say that you are bringing that to the world and to Sandpoint, and I've been honored to experience that myself. So thank you. So, Michael, I have one last question for you. You talk about creating space. What do you do personally to create space for yourself? What are some practices you use?
Good question. Lately, I've been starting to pick up the guitar again and relearn some chords. I played as a child, and in a teenager, my mom said, "You don't have to keep playing if you don't want to." I'm like, "Okay." And I stopped. I'm like, why did I ever stop that? So what gives life to me? And that just strumming, I'll go sit on the dock and mindlessly strum now. But I also love to have deep connection with others. I'm part of a men's group in Sandpoint. It's been going for 17 years now, and that gives life, recharges me. So having a circle of people that I can rely on, having the exercise in my life. I love hiking. I love anything to do with water. So sailing, swimming, canoeing is a big part of my life, having been an Outward Bound guide for 10 years. Those kinds of things, getting out in the wilderness and nature, and which is an awesome place for us to live here, Debbie, and Sandpoint, where we're next to the lake, we're next to the ski mountain. We got nature all around us. I love traveling around the world, and my work allows me to do that. I got to work in Singapore and India and South Africa and all over Europe just before COVID, in the 6 months before COVID. And there's an enlivening part of that too. That's a learning edge for me. How are we the same and how are we different everywhere?
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I know that's part of why I like to travel, is I like to immerse in the culture and just learn about other people and just be curious about it. So that always brings me a lot of joy and energy too. So Michael, thank you so much for being open to having conversation and talking about what you do in the world. And it's really important work. And so I thank you. It takes courage and some resiliency to do what you do. And I know I appreciate it. So if people were wanting to get a hold of you or find out more about how and what you do, where would you send them?
Well, let's see. They could Google my name, Michael Welp, and see my TED Talk, which is a sort of an overview of a core message to white guys. They could Google the Insider Outsider podcast and watch some of that. That's through my company, or my company name, White Men as Full Diversity Partners, which is WMFDP.com. There's a lot of background in the work stuff there. The book I wrote, 4 Days to Change, you mentioned, is also, that's on Amazon as an Audible, Kindle, and that's a story of 4 white guys going through the White Men's Caucus. This allows anybody, and women too, people of color, to be a fly on the wall. What's the conversation that needs to happen amongst white guys to have us awakening and being able to intervene with each other, to be better allies, in solidarity with you and others who want to create an equitable world. Those are some of the things that I think of.
Great. Well, Michael, thank you again. It's been an honor to have you on, and I look forward to maybe meeting you at Evans Brothers again for a cup of coffee sometime soon. So.
Sounds great. Maybe out in the boats too, in the lake.
That would work. Just don't expect me to do much but pull a rope.
All right.
Or I'll do more. You just have to tell me what to do.
I'm sure you would get me to laugh somehow.
That's true.
That would be as valuable as the rope.
I do love to laugh. That is a true statement. So perfect.
Thank you for doing what you do here too.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in. And until the next episode, have a fantastic couple weeks.